February 24, 2022. Russian tanks roll into Ukraine. Cities are bombarded. A sovereign nation is plunged into chaos. Western leaders quickly denounce Vladimir Putin, calling the invasion unprovoked, brutal, and a clear violation of key international law. But behind the headlines, a darker question lurks. Was this war really unprovoked? Did the West, over decades, push Russia into a corner by expanding NATO right up to its doorstep? Did Western leaders break a Cold War-era promise that NATO would never move eastward, not 1 inch? And is this crisis eerily similar to one of the most dangerous standoffs in modern history, the Cuban Missile Crisis? This is the controversial theory, that the West didn't just allow this war, it helped create the conditions for it. The year is 1990. The Berlin Wall has just fallen. The Soviet Union is teetering. As the Cold War dissolves, diplomacy fills the vacuum. Western and Soviet leaders sit down to negotiate the terms of German reunification. And here's where the theory begins. In February 1990, US Secretary of State James Baker meets with Mikhail Gorbachev. In a now famous conversation, Baker reportedly assures Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if the Soviets allowed Germany to reunify under Western alignment. The phrase appears in diplomatic cables and memos. It was said during a pivotal moment when the Soviet military was still stationed in East Germany, and the USSR could have obstructed reunification. To many Russians, and even some Western historians, this statement constituted a de facto deal. The Soviet Union would pull back, and NATO would stay put. However, there was no formal treaty. Western officials would later argue that the statement applied only to Germany, not to all of Eastern Europe. But Gorbachev, in later interviews, said he interpreted it more broadly. So did many in the Kremlin. Conspiracy theorists claim this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategic bait and switch, a false assurance meant to neutralize the Soviet threat, while NATO prepared to expand. After the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, but NATO did not. Instead of fading into irrelevance, the alliance grew stronger. And, more controversially, it expanded. In 1999, NATO welcomed Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. These were once Soviet satellite states. Then, in 2004, came Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former republics of the USSR itself. In Moscow's eyes, this wasn't just strategic realignment, it was encirclement. Russian officials warned that NATO's presence on their doorstep would destabilize regional security. But Washington and Brussels dismissed these warnings, claiming that NATO was a defensive alliance. And then came the most provocative step. In 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. The move had no timeline and no concrete action plan, but the political message was unmistakable. For Russia, this was a red line. Ukraine was not just any country, it shared deep cultural, historical, and economic ties with Russia. In many ways, Ukraine is considered the cradle of Russian civilization. A Ukraine aligned with NATO, and potentially hosting Western troops or missiles, was viewed by the Kremlin as an existential threat. To understand the Russian perspective, we need to go back to 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US discovers that the Soviet Union is placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast. President John F. Kennedy responds with an ultimatum: remove the missiles or face possible nuclear war. The Soviets eventually back down, but not before the world comes terrifyingly close to total destruction. At the heart of that standoff was a simple principle. Great powers don't tolerate hostile military alliances near their borders. So when Russia sees NATO creeping into Ukraine, right on its frontier, some say it's a mirror image of Cuba. The roles are reversed. The US is now the one expanding. Russia is the one feeling threatened. Even respected American diplomats have warned about this. Former US Ambassador to Moscow, George Kennan, once called NATO expansion a tragic mistake, and yet the West kept going. So, here's the theory. Russia didn't invade Ukraine purely out of imperial ambition. It invaded because NATO, over decades, crossed line after line after line. From Moscow's view, the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, which ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, was orchestrated or supported by the West. It brought a pro-NATO, pro-EU government to power. Soon after, Russia annexed Crimea, citing the need to protect ethnic Russians and secure its naval base. The war in Donbass followed, a frozen conflict. But by 2021, with Ukraine increasing ties with NATO, receiving arms and hosting joint military exercises, the Kremlin's alarm bells rang louder. Whether you view Putin as a defensive realist or a revisionist authoritarian, the conspiracy suggests one thing. The invasion of 2022 wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of 30 years of perceived Western betrayal. Here's where the theory goes beyond strategy and into profit and power. NATO expansion didn't just happen for security, it brought massive financial gain. Each new NATO member is required to meet defense spending minimums. Most of that money goes to buying US-made weapons. Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon reap billions. Then there's energy. Before the war, Europe relied heavily on Russian natural gas, especially through pipelines like Nord Stream. After the invasion, the EU imposed sanctions, cut Russian energy, and turned to American liquefied natural gas, LNG. The result? US. Gas companies profited, and Russia lost a major geopolitical tool. So in this version of events, the war doesn't just weaken Russia, it strengthens Western militaries, boosts defense profits, and reconfigures energy markets in America's favor. Another key piece in this conspiracy theory is the belief that the United States orchestrated a regime change in Ukraine, a soft coup to replace a pro-Russian government with a pro-Western one. According to this theory, the 2014 Euromaidan revolution wasn't a spontaneous pro-democracy uprising, but a coordinated operation backed by the US State Department. The story begins with Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine's democratically elected president at the time. Though not a Putin puppet, Yanukovych leaned toward closer ties with Russia and away from the European Union. In late 2013, he rejected an EU trade deal, sparking massive protests in Kyiv's Maidan Square. These protests soon escalated into violent clashes, and in February 2014, Yanukovych fled the country. A new pro-Western government was formed almost immediately. Conspiracy theorists point to US involvement in these events. Most notably, a leaked phone call between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt surfaced online, where they appeared to be discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government. Nuland is heard saying, quote, "Yats is the guy," referring to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who later became Prime Minister. This, critics argue, is proof that the US was handpicking Ukraine's new leadership behind the scenes. And though Zelensky wouldn't rise to power until 2019, conspiracy theorists claim his Western-friendly stance and anti-corruption message made him the perfect long-term figurehead for American strategic interests. They view him as the charismatic, media-savvy face of a government aligned not with Ukrainian sovereignty, but with Western geopolitical goals. So, was this war provoked? Did NATO break a promise and push too far? Or was Russia always going to assert its dominance over Ukraine, no matter what the West did? This conspiracy theory forces us to look at uncomfortable truths and to acknowledge that in geopolitics, intentions don't always matter. What matters is perception, power, and consequence. And as always, it's the innocent who suffer the most. Thanks for watching. We want to hear from you. Do you think NATO expansion provoked this war, or is that just a convenient excuse for aggression? Hit like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And remember, question everything, but follow the facts.